In a quiet little neighborhood where everyone seemed to have their lives perfectly together, there lived a couple named James and Rachel. They had recently moved into their dream home, a cozy house with a nice backyard, perfect for barbecues and family time. Their two kids were excited about the new school district, and James loved how close everything was to work. Life felt good. Too good, almost. But what they didn't know when they signed the papers and unpacked their moving boxes was that this suburban paradise came with its own set of unwritten rules and one very particular enforcer. Her name was Corinne, and she ruled the Homeowners Association, HOA, like it was her personal kingdom. She wasn't just any HOA member. She was the HOA member. The one who sent passive-aggressive letters if your mailbox paint faded or if your Christmas lights stayed up past January 5th, 10th. Corinne took pride in making sure every blade of grass on the street looked exactly the same height and that no car dared park anywhere but inside a garage. To her, these things weren't petty details, they were principles. Principles worth fighting for. And boy, did she fight hard. One sunny afternoon, Rachel pulled into their driveway after running errands. She'd spent hours grocery shopping, picking up dry cleaning, and dropping off library books. All she wanted now was to unload the bags, relax for a bit, and maybe enjoy a cup of coffee before starting dinner. But as fate would have it, something caught Corinne's eye from across the street. Rachel hadn't parked perfectly straight. One of her tires was slightly over the line where the driveway met the sidewalk, just enough to stick out by a few inches. Now, most people wouldn't bat an eyelash at such a minor thing. After all, it was her driveway, her property. Who cared? Well, Corinne cared. Oh, how she cared. From behind her lace curtains, Corinne watched Rachel step out of the car, completely oblivious to the storm brewing in Corinne's mind. Clutching her phone like it was her lifeline, Corinne muttered under her breath about people these days and how no one respects the rules anymore. Then, without wasting another second, she dialed the local police department. "Hello. Yes, I need to report a violation," Corinne said firmly into the receiver. "There's someone parking illegally in our neighborhood. It's outrageous. Someone needs to do something about it immediately." On the other end of the line, the dispatcher sounded confused. "Ma'am, can you clarify? Are we talking about public roads or private property?" "It's complicated," Corinne replied, trying to sound authoritative. "Just send someone over. You'll see what I mean." What Karen failed to mention during this call was that the so-called violator wasn't some random stranger. It was Rachel, a neighbor who happened to live right there in the community. And not only that, but Rachel also happened to be Lieutenant Rachel Miller, a highly respected officer in the very same police department Karen was calling. Of course, Karen had no idea about this last part. If she did, she might have thought twice before dialing those 3 numbers. When the patrol car rolled up a short while later, Rachel was still unloading groceries, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around her. She saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror and assumed it was routine, a quick check. Maybe someone had reported suspicious activity nearby. Nothing unusual, really. So she stepped out of her car, still holding a bag of apples and a carton of milk, and greeted the officers with a friendly smile. "Hi there. Everything okay?" Rachel asked casually. Officer Davis, a young rookie visibly nervous about interacting with anyone above his rank, shifted awkwardly. He glanced at his partner, then back at Rachel. Ma'am, we got a call about, improper parking?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Improper parking?" "In my own driveway." Officer Davis hesitated. "Well, apparently, someone says your tire is touching the sidewalk. Technically, it's against HOA guidelines." At this point, Rachel couldn't help but chuckle. Improper parking? Seriously? She looked past the officers and spotted Karen, standing a safe distance away, arms crossed, wearing a smug expression as if she'd single-handedly saved the neighborhood from chaos. Rachel sighed, realizing this whole thing was more about Karen's ego than actual law enforcement. "Well," Rachel said calmly, "I appreciate you coming out to check. But unless there's an actual municipal law being broken here, I think we're okay." She paused for effect, then added, "By the way, I'm Lieutenant Miller. Maybe you've heard of me?" The color drained from Officer Davis's face. Clearly, he had. Everyone in the department knew Lieutenant Miller. She was known for her sharp instincts, fairness, and dedication to serving the community. Calling her out for something as trivial as a crooked tire in her own driveway was beyond embarrassing. It was laughable. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Officer Davis quickly apologized. "Oh, Lieutenant, I'm so sorry. We didn't realize." "It's fine," Rachel interrupted, waving him off. "No harm done. Just tell whoever called this and that next time. They should probably knock on the door and talk to their neighbors instead of calling 911. With that, the officers left, shaking their heads at the absurdity of the call. Meanwhile, Karen's triumphant grin began to falter. She had expected Rachel to be intimidated, maybe even apologetic. Instead, she'd been cool, collected, and downright unbothered. Worse yet, Karen realized too late that she might have bitten off more than she could chew as Rachel finished unloading her groceries. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be the end of it. Karen wasn't the type to let things go quietly. Something told her this bizarre encounter was only the beginning of a much bigger headache. But for now, she pushed the thought aside, poured herself that cup of coffee, and tried to focus on the positives: her loving family, her beautiful home, and the fact that she owned the moral high ground and possibly the police department when it came to dealing with Karen. After the awkward parking fiasco, Rachel thought the whole thing would blow over. She figured Karen might grumble about it for a day or two, but eventually life would go back to normal. After all, how much trouble could someone cause over a tire that barely touched the sidewalk? But Rachel underestimated just how petty and persistent Karen could be. The very next morning, as Rachel was getting ready for work, James walked into the kitchen holding an envelope. His face was a mix of confusion and amusement. Honey," he said, waving the envelope in the air. "Looks like we got a letter from the HOA. Rachel groaned. "Already? What now?" James opened the envelope and read aloud. It was a formal notice from the HOA, written in that stiff, overly official tone Karen loved so much. The letter accused Rachel of repeated violations of HOA guidelines, specifically citing her improper parking as a disregard for community standards. It went on to warn her that further infractions could result in fines or worse, legal action. Rachel stared at the letter, shaking her head. "This has to be a joke. Does she really think sending me this is going to scare me?" James chuckled. "Well, it's Karen. When does she ever do anything halfway?" Rachel tossed the letter onto the counter and grabbed her coffee mug. "Fine. Let her send all the letters she wants. I've got better things to worry about." But Karen wasn't done yet. Over the next few days, Rachel started noticing little things around the neighborhood. Her mailbox, which had been perfectly fine before, suddenly developed a mysterious dent. A trash bag left outside their garage overnight disappeared without a trace. And one evening, as she was watering the plants in the front yard, she caught sight of Karen peeking through her living room curtains, pretending to adjust her blinds but clearly spying that it was subtle stuff. Nothing outright illegal, but enough to make Rachel realize Karen wasn't planning to let this go quietly. Still, Rachel refused to engage. Every time James suggested confronting Karen or filing a complaint with the HOA board, Rachel shook her head. "No point," she'd say. She's just trying to get under my skin. If I react, I'm playing right into her hands." What Rachel didn't know was that Karen was gearing up for round 2, and this time, she wasn't messing around. A week later, Rachel received another unexpected visitor, 2 plainclothes officers showing up at her doorstep. This time, it wasn't about parking. They introduced themselves as internal affairs investigators and explained they were there because of a formal complaint filed against her. Apparently, Karen had gone straight to the police department accusing Rachel of abusing her authority during the parking incident. According to Karen, Rachel had intimidated the responding officers and used her rank to bully innocent neighbors. Rachel listened patiently, her expression calm despite the absurdity of the accusations. Once the investigators finished explaining, she invited them inside and offered them coffee. Sitting down at the dining table, she calmly addressed each point in the complaint. First, Rachel began, "I never once mentioned my rank during the initial interaction unless asked directly. Second, I did not raise my voice, threaten anyone, or behave unprofessionally in any way. And third, if you talk to Officers Davis and Martinez, the ones who responded to the call, they'll confirm that everything I'm saying is true." The investigators exchanged glances. They knew Rachel well. She was respected throughout the department for her integrity and leadership. None of this sounded like her. Still, protocol required them to investigate, so they assured her they'd look into the matter thoroughly. As soon as the investigators left, Rachel felt a flicker of frustration. She hated being dragged into drama, especially when it came from someone as ridiculous as Karen. But more than that, she felt a growing sense of unease. Karen wasn't just annoying anymore, she was dangerous. Accusing a fellow officer of misconduct wasn't something people did lightly. It meant Karen was willing to escalate things far beyond what Rachel had anticipated. That night, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with James, going over the situation. "I don't want to stoop to her level," Rachel said firmly, "but ignoring her isn't working either. She's not going to stop until she gets what she wants." James leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "So what do we do? Just sit here and let her keep throwing accusations at us?" Rachel tapped her fingers on the table, thinking. Then, slowly, a plan began to form. "Maybe it's time I stopped reacting and started investigating." Over the next few days, Rachel decided to dig deeper into Karen's activities within the HOA. At first glance, Karen seemed like your typical suburban busybody, a woman obsessed with rules and order. But Rachel suspected there was more to her behavior than met the eye. Why was Karen so determined to control every aspect of the neighborhood? And why did she seem so eager to target certain residents while ignoring others? With help from a few trusted colleagues, Rachel began gathering information. She reviewed past HOA meeting minutes, financial reports, and resident complaints. What she discovered shocked even her. Karen had been using her position as HOA president to manipulate the system. She routinely issued fines for minor infractions, things like having a lawn chair left out overnight or failing to trim hedges to exact specifications. These fines added up quickly, and instead of depositing the money into the HOA account, Karen had been pocketing it herself. Worse, she'd falsified records to cover her tracks, making it look like the funds were being used for community improvements that never actually happened. But that wasn't all. Rachel also uncovered evidence that Karen had pressured several residents into selling their homes below market value, claiming they were violating HOA rules and threatening lawsuits if they didn't comply. In reality, Karen had planned to buy these properties herself or sell them to friends at a fraction of their worth. Armed with this information, Rachel realized she had two choices: ignore it and hope Karen eventually moved on, or expose her crimes and put an end to the madness once and for all. For Rachel, the decision was easy. She couldn't stand by and let someone exploit the system, especially when it affected her neighbors. Rachel approached the situation methodically. First, she compiled all the evidence into a detailed report, including bank statements, forged documents, and testimonies from residents who had been bullied or scammed by Karen. Next, she scheduled a meeting with Internal Affairs to ensure transparency. She wanted to make it clear that she wasn't acting out of personal vendetta, but rather as a concerned citizen and officer looking out for the community. Finally, she reached out to the HOA board members, asking them to attend an emergency meeting. Most of them agreed, curious about why Rachel, a respected police lieutenant, was suddenly taking such an interest in HOA affairs. On the day of the meeting, Rachel arrived early, setting up folders and preparing her presentation. As the board members trickled in, she greeted each one warmly, careful not to reveal too much up front. When Karen finally walked in, late as usual, she strutted in like she owned the place, wearing her signature blazer and carrying her clipboard. She glanced at Rachel briefly, smirking as if to say, asterisk, see? I told you I'd win. Asterisk. Rachel let her have her moment. She knew the truth was about to come crashing down on Karen, and when it did, there'd be no recovering from it. When everyone was seated, Rachel stood up and cleared her throat. Thank you all for coming today, she began. There are some serious issues affecting our community, and I believe it's time we address them head on. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically, muttering something under her breath about wasting time. But Rachel ignored her, opening the first folder and laying out the facts. One by one, she presented the evidence, letting the weight of Karen's parade action sink in. By the time Rachel finished, the room was silent. Even Karen looked pale, her usual confidence replaced by sheer panic. Before she could protest, Rachel turned to the board members. This isn't about revenge or personal grievances. It's about protecting our community from corruption. If we don't act now, this will only get worse. Without hesitation, the board voted unanimously to suspend Karen from her position and hand over all evidence to the authorities. Within minutes, officers arrived to arrest her, charging her with embezzlement, fraud, and harassment. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, Rachel felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that justice had been served, but sadness that someone could become so consumed by power and control. Still, she reminded herself that this outcome wasn't just about punishing Karen, it was about restoring trust and fairness to the neighborhood. And for the first time in weeks, Rachel allowed herself to breathe easy. Rachel had done her homework. She knew Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor with a clipboard and an inflated sense of authority. She was a problem, one that needed to be dealt with carefully. The evidence she'd gathered painted a clear picture. Karen wasn't just breaking HOA rules. She was exploiting them for personal gain. And Rachel wasn't about to let someone like that keep running rampant in her community. But before taking any drastic steps, Rachel decided to dig even deeper. If Karen thought she could hide behind her title as HOA president and intimidate people into silence, she was dead wrong. Rachel's years in law enforcement had taught her how to connect the dots, follow paper trails, and uncover hidden motives. This time, she was going to use those skills not just for her family, but for everyone living on her street. The first thing Rachel did was reach out to some of her neighbors discreetly. She didn't want to cause panic or spread rumors, so she approached it casually. Over coffee or while chatting at the mailbox, she'd ask questions like, "Hey, have you ever had issues with the HOA fines?" Or, "Do you know where exactly our dues go?" At first, most people shrugged it off, saying things like, "Oh, you know Karen, always nitpicking." But when Rachel mentioned specific examples, like the disappearing funds or the sudden drop in property values, people started opening up. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Linda, admitted she'd been fined repeatedly for leaving her recycling bin out overnight. "It got so bad," Linda said, shaking her head. "I ended up paying hundreds of dollars just to avoid more trouble. I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight her." Another neighbor, Tom, who worked construction, shared a story about being forced to sell his house after Karen accused him of violating landscaping guidelines. "She said my trees were too tall and blocked the view," he explained. "Then she pressured me to sell cheap because no one would buy it otherwise." Turns out she bought it herself through some shell company. Each conversation gave Rachel another piece of the puzzle. It became clear that Karen wasn't just targeting random homeowners, she had a strategy. She went after people who either couldn't afford to fight back or didn't understand their rights. For Karen, it was less about enforcing rules and more about consolidating power and profit. With mounting evidence, Rachel knew she had to act fast. But exposing Karen wouldn't be easy. The woman had spent years building alliances within the HOA board, manipulating records and silencing critics. If Rachel made one misstep, Karen could turn the tables and accuse her of harassment or retaliation. That's why Rachel decided to bring in reinforcements. She reached out to a few trusted colleagues at the police department, not to bend the rules, but to ensure everything was handled by the book. One of them, Detective Harris, agreed to help review the financial documents Rachel had collected. "This is serious stuff," Harris told her after going through the files. "We're talking embezzlement, forgery, maybe even extortion. You've got enough here to take her down, but we need to make sure every detail checks out." Together, they cross-referenced bank statements, tracked payments, and identified discrepancies in the HOA's official reports. They also interviewed several residents willing to testify against Karen, ensuring their stories aligned with the evidence. By the time they finished, Rachel had a solid case, airtight and undeniable. Still, Rachel hesitated. Taking down Karen meant airing dirty laundry in front of the entire neighborhood. People might feel uncomfortable, or worse, targeted. She didn't want to create chaos. She wanted to restore order. So, instead of rushing to judgment, Rachel took a step back and thought about the best way to present the truth without causing unnecessary drama. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. A routine HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Rachel requested permission to speak during the open forum portion. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs, discussions about holiday decorations or pool maintenance schedules, but this time, Rachel planned to shake things up. On the day of the meeting, Rachel arrived early, dressed professionally in slacks and a blazer. She carried a folder filled with copies of her findings, ready to distribute them if needed. As other residents trickled in, she greeted them warmly, making small talk to ease any tension. When Karen walked in, late as usual, Rachel noticed how confidently she carried herself, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. When it was finally Rachel's turn to speak, she stood up, cleared her throat, and addressed the room. "Thank you all for letting me share something important today," she began. Her tone was calm but firm, commanding attention without sounding confrontational. "Over the past few weeks, I've been looking into some concerns regarding how our HOA operates. What I found has raised serious questions about transparency, fairness, and accountability." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing trouble. "What is this nonsense?" she muttered loud enough for nearby residents to hear, ignoring the interruption. Rachel continued. "Let me start with the fines. Many of us have received notices for minor infractions, things like lawn chairs left out overnight or cars parked slightly askew. While these may seem trivial, the cumulative effect is significant. Some residents have paid thousands of dollars in penalties over the years. Yet, when we look at where that money goes, there's no record of it benefiting the community. Rachel paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Around the room, people exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Even the HOA board members looked uneasy. But that's not all, Rachel added. Some of you may have been pressured into selling your homes under false pretenses. Others have been threatened with lawsuits or further fines unless they complied with unreasonable demands. These actions aren't just unethical, they're illegal. At this point, Rachel opened her folder and handed out copies of the evidence to everyone present. Bank statements showed irregular deposits into Karen's personal account. Emails revealed threats made to residents who refused to pay excessive fines. Property records exposed shady transactions involving homes sold below market value, all linked back to Karen. Karen jumped to her feet, red-faced and sputtering. "This is outrageous. Lies, all lies. How dare you accuse me of such nonsense?" Rachel remained composed, her voice steady. "If you're innocent, then you have nothing to worry about. However, based on the evidence, I believe it's time. We involve the authorities." Before Karen could protest further, 2 uniformed officers entered the room. They'd been waiting outside, alerted earlier by Rachel as a precaution. Without hesitation, they approached Karen, handcuffs in hand. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and harassment. Please come with us." The room erupted in gasps and whispers as Karen was led away, protesting loudly. Residents clapped and cheered, finally free from the shadow of fear she'd cast over the neighborhood for so long. After the dust settled, Rachel stayed behind to answer questions and reassure her neighbors. "This isn't about revenge," she emphasized. "It's about protecting our community and holding people accountable. Together, we can rebuild trust and make sure something like this never happens again." As the crowd dispersed, several residents thanked Rachel for standing up to Karen. Linda hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You have no idea how much this means to us," she said. "For years we felt powerless. Now we can breathe again." Rachel smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Taking down Karen hadn't been easy, but it was worth it. Not only had she protected her family, but she'd also given her neighbors a fresh start, a chance to live without fear or intimidation. And as she walked home that evening, hand in hand with James, Rachel realized something important. Sometimes, doing the right thing requires courage, patience, and a little bit of detective work. But in the end, justice always finds its way. The fallout from Karen's arrest rippled through the neighborhood like a shockwave. For years, residents had lived under her thumb, too afraid or too exhausted to push back against her relentless micromanagement. But now, with Karen gone and handcuffed no less, they felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. It was as if they'd been holding their breath for years and were finally allowed to exhale. Rachel became an overnight hero in the community. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance started stopping by her house just to say thank you. Some brought homemade cookies or pies. Others simply wanted to share stories about how Karen had made their lives miserable. One elderly man named George even showed up on her doorstep with tears in his eyes. "You saved us," he said, his voice trembling. "I haven't slept properly in months because I was so scared she'd find me again." Rachel listened patiently, offering words of encouragement whenever someone needed to vent. She didn't want any of this attention, but she understood why it was happening. People weren't just grateful. They were healing. For the first time in years, they could talk openly about their frustrations without fear of retaliation. And Rachel, whether she liked it or not, had become the face of that liberation. But while most neighbors celebrated, not everyone was thrilled about Karen's downfall. A small group of loyalists, people who had either benefited from her schemes or feared rocking the boat, tried to defend her. They whispered behind closed doors, accusing Rachel of overstepping and playing judge, jury, and executioner. Who does she think she is? One woman muttered at the grocery store. Just because she wears a badge doesn't mean she gets to decide what's right for all of us. These murmurs reached Rachel's ears eventually, courtesy of James, who always seemed to overhear things at work or during his morning runs. He urged her to address the criticism head-on before it spiraled into something bigger. If you don't, clear the air, he warned. They'll keep spreading doubt. You know how gossip works, Rachel agreed, though reluctantly. She hated confrontation, especially when it involved people she barely knew. Still, she recognized the importance of transparency. If she wanted to move forward and help rebuild trust within the community, she needed to confront these lingering doubts directly. So, she organized another meeting, not an official HOA gathering. This time, but a casual get-together in her backyard. She invited everyone on the block, including those who had supported Karen. Her goal wasn't to argue or convince anyone. It was to foster open dialogue and remind everyone that they were neighbors first, strangers second. On the day of the meeting, Rachel set up folding chairs in her backyard and laid out snacks and drinks on a picnic table. As guests arrived, she greeted each person warmly, making sure no one felt excluded. The atmosphere was tense at first, with clusters of people sticking to their usual groups. But as conversations began to flow, the tension slowly melted away. When everyone was settled, Rachel stood up and addressed the crowd. "Thanks for coming today," she began, her tone warm but firm. "I know we've all been through a lot recently, and I wanted to take some time to talk openly about where we go from here." She paused, scanning the faces around her. Some looked curious, others skeptical. Taking a deep breath, she continued, "I'm not here to justify my actions or tell you what to think. What happened with Karen wasn't personal. It was about accountability. When I found evidence of wrongdoing, I couldn't ignore it. Not as a neighbor, and certainly not as someone who swore an oath to uphold justice." A few heads nodded in agreement, but Rachel noticed a couple of people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. She decided to address their concerns directly. "I know some of you might feel uneasy about how everything played out. Maybe you think I overstepped, or maybe you're worried about what comes next. That's okay. I respect your opinions. But let me ask you this. Wouldn't you rather live in a community where everyone plays by the same rules? Where fairness matters more than fear?" Her question hung in the air, prompting a few murmurs of approval. Encouraged, Rachel pressed on. "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. Together, we have a chance to create something better, to build a neighborhood based on trust, respect, and cooperation. But it starts with honesty. So, if anyone has questions or concerns, now's the time to voice them." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a young mother named Lisa raised her hand tentatively. "What happens to the HOA now?" she asked. "Are we just going to dissolve it?" Rachel smiled, appreciating the practicality of the question. "No, we're not dissolving it. In fact, we need the HOA more than ever, but it has to change. We need leaders who prioritize the community's needs over personal agendas. Leaders who listen instead of dictate. I've already spoken with a few board members, and they're willing to step up and reform the system. But it's going to take all of us working together to make it happen." Another neighbor, a middle-aged man named Steve, spoke up next. "What? About the fines? Do we still have to pay them?" Rachel shook her head. "Not unless they're fair and justified. Moving forward, every decision will be transparent. No more secret meetings or hidden fees. We'll hold regular town halls so everyone knows exactly where their money is going. and if someone disagrees with a ruling, they'll have the right to appeal without fear of retaliation. As the discussion continued, the mood shifted noticeably. The initial skepticism gave way to cautious optimism. Even those who had initially sided with Karen seemed to soften. Realizing that Rachel wasn't trying to impose her will, she genuinely cared about the community. By the end of the evening, laughter filled the air as neighbors mingled freely, sharing food and stories. Kids chased each other across the yard, while adults exchanged contact information and promised to organize more gatherings in the future. It was a stark contrast to the tension that had plagued the neighborhood for so long. Later that night, as Rachel sat on her porch with James, sipping tea and watching fireflies dance in the twilight, she reflected on everything that had transpired. Taking down Karen hadn't been easy, in fact. It had tested her patience, resilience, and faith in humanity. But seeing her neighbors come together, united by a shared vision for the future, made it all worthwhile. "You did good, James," said softly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Real good." Rachel leaned into him, smiling faintly. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "They did it themselves. All I did was give them permission to hope." And hope, she realized, was the most powerful force of all. With it, anything was possible, even turning a toxic suburban nightmare into a thriving, supportive community. With Karen out of the picture and the HOA restructured under new leadership, the neighborhood began to transform in ways no one had expected. It wasn't an overnight change. There were still lingering tensions, unresolved grievances, and a few stubborn holdouts who clung to old habits, but the overall mood was lighter, freer. For the first time in years, people felt like they could truly breathe. Rachel watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. She knew she hadn't single-handedly fixed everything. That kind of thinking was exactly what got Karen into trouble in the first place. But she also knew her actions had sparked something, a shift in perspective, a renewed sense of possibility. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved hello as they passed each other on morning walks. Kids played together in yards instead of being cooped up indoors because their parents feared breaking some obscure rule. And the dreaded HOA meetings? They became less about nitpicking and more about collaboration. One Saturday afternoon, Rachel decided to host a backyard barbecue to celebrate the community's fresh start. Word spread quickly, and soon enough, nearly every household on the block RSVP'd. People brought dishes to share homemade lasagnas, potato salads, trays of brownies, and set them up on long tables draped with colorful cloths. Music played. Softly in the background, laughter echoed through the air, and for once, nobody worried about noise complaints or parking violations. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light over the gathering, Rachel stood back and took it all in. Kids chased each other around with water guns, while adults lounged in lawn chairs, sipping lemonade and swapping stories. Even George, the elderly man who had thanked her earlier, joined in, sharing tales of his youth that left everyone chuckling. James sidled up beside her, holding 2 cold bottles of soda. "Looks like mission accomplished," he said, handing her one. Rachel grinned, popping the cap off her drink. "Feels good, doesn't it?" James nodded. "Yeah, but I think we owe most of it to you. You didn't just take down Karen, you gave everyone permission to trust each other again." Rachel shook her head. "I didn't do anything special. I just pointed out the truth. The real work happened after that. Look at them." She gestured toward the lively scene around them. "They're rebuilding this place themselves." And it was true. Over the past few weeks, neighbors had come together to tackle projects they'd previously been too intimidated or too divided to attempt. Someone organized a weekend cleanup day where families worked side by side to pick up litter and trim overgrown bushes along the streets. Another group started a community garden, planting flowers and vegetables in a vacant lot near the entrance of the subdivision. There were even plans to repaint the playground equipment at the park, turning it into a cheerful rainbow of colors. The changes weren't just physical, either. Conversations flowed more easily now, without the underlying tension that had characterized interactions during Karen's reign. People shared advice, offered help when needed, and generally looked out for one another. When Linda, the retired teacher, sprained her ankle, 3 different neighbors showed up within hours to mow her lawn and bring her dinner. Tom, the construction worker, repaired a leaky roof for an elderly couple down the street free of charge. These small acts of kindness added up, creating a web of support that strengthened the entire community. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were still moments of friction, reminders that rebuilding trust takes time. A few residents grumbled about the new HOA board's decisions, accusing them of favoritism or inefficiency. Others griped about the lack of strict enforcement, claiming the neighborhood was sliding into chaos without Karen's iron fist. But these voices were quieter now, drowned out by the overwhelming positivity of those who embraced the changes. Rachel handled the criticism gracefully, reminding herself that perfection wasn't the goal. Progress was. Every complaint was an opportunity to listen, to explain, and to find common ground. Slowly but surely, even the skeptics began to see the value in cooperation over control. That evening, as the barbecue wound down and guests started heading home, Rachel found herself sitting alone on the porch steps, watching the stars appear one by one in the night sky. James joined her a moment later, handing her a blanket to ward off the chill. "You okay?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "Yeah," Rachel replied, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "About how weird life is sometimes. A few months ago, I never would have guessed that a parking ticket or whatever you call it could turn our lives upside down like this. And yet here we are, stronger than ever. It's funny how the little things can lead to big changes," James chuckled. "Funny or terrifying? Because if you ask me, I'm glad we're not dealing with Karen anymore." Rachel laughed, nudging him playfully. "Me too. But seriously, it makes me wonder. How many other neighborhoods are out there, stuck under someone like her? How many people feel trapped but don't know how to break free?" James thought about it for a moment. "Probably more than we realize, but maybe your story will inspire them. Maybe someone else will hear about this and decide to stand up too." Rachel smiled, liking the idea. She'd never sought recognition or fame, but if sharing her experience helped others find courage, then it was worth it. After all, communities thrived when people cared, not just about themselves, but about each other. The next day, Rachel received a message from Detective Harris, the colleague who had helped her investigate Karen's crimes. Attached to the email was a news article titled *Suburban Heroine: How One Woman Took Down Corruption in Her Neighborhood. Apparently, word of Rachel's efforts had reached the local paper, and a reporter wanted to write a feature about her. At first, Rachel hesitated. She didn't want the attention, especially since she saw herself as just one part of a larger effort. But James encouraged her to embrace it. "Think about it," he said. "If your story helps even one person realize they have the power to make a difference, isn't that worth it?" Reluctantly, Rachel agreed to the interview. The resulting article painted her as a champion of justice, highlighting not only her role in exposing Karen's corruption, but also the community's collective resilience in overcoming it. Readers flooded the comments section with praise, gratitude, and questions about how they could improve their own neighborhoods. Inspired by the response, Rachel teamed up with a nonprofit organization focused on promoting transparency and accountability. in homeowners associations. Together, they created a guidebook filled with tips and resources for residents navigating similar challenges. From identifying red flags to organizing grassroots movements, the guide aimed to empower people to take control of their communities. Months later, as Rachel stood in her driveway watching her kids ride their bikes down the freshly paved road, she reflected on how far they'd come. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was better, stronger, kinder, more united. Karen's arrest had been the catalyst, but the real transformation came from the people themselves. They chose to let go of fear, to reach out instead of shutting down, to build bridges instead of walls. And in doing so, they proved that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple outward, changing lives in ways no one could predict. As Rachel turned to head inside, she caught sight of Linda waving from across the street. Next to her, Tom was helping George carry groceries into his house. Smiling to herself, Rachel realized something important. Heroes weren't born, they were made. And sometimes, all it took was one person standing up to remind everyone else that they had the power to do the same.